Okay, thank you all for joining me today. My name is Galen Newman. I am Associate Professor at Texas A&M University in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning. I just want to thank the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences for their funding behind this research here as part of the Texas A&M University Superfund, NIH Superfund Research Center. And my team here, Yoo-Jung Kim, Karishma Joshi, and Jiali Liu, we all are affiliated through the Center for Housing and Urban Development. And what I'm going to present to you today is a project in Tampa, Florida, which uses geodesign to basically predict for both future urban growth in Tampa and also future flood risk, considering sea level rise. And then we do three different master plans based on different scenarios of prediction. And then we use landscape performance models to evaluate the effectiveness of each scenario. In particular, what we're looking at is stormwater runoff, contamination, and contamination. So basically pollutant transferal during flood events, which approach is the most effective. And we compare the business as usual, as we call it, which is the current growth patterns to actual growth according to the comprehensive plans and the policies, and then more of a resilient growth pattern where we take all of the future development out of the actual 100-year floodplain. So let's jump right into this, if we can. So again, the project's in Tampa. If you look to the kind of eastern side of Tampa here on the map, this red dot, that's the site location. But Tampa's pretty vulnerable to flooding, in particular hurricanes and from storm surge from hurricanes and sea level rise. So it's one of the top 5 cities in the U.S. Most vulnerable to hurricanes, and there's been 63 hurricanes in Tampa since 1851. So a significant amount. And it's also one of the top listed as one of the top 25 cities most vulnerable to sea level rise, and particularly the almost 60,000 residents that live near the coast in Tampa. They're at risk for the effects of sea level rise. And we're going to look at, in particular on our site here, the current flood risk and then what the future flood risk is going to be using NOAA's different scenarios of sea level rise and their projections. So again, this is our site on the right, the eastern side of Tampa here. You can kind of see a zoom in of the site at the northern edge. The north side of the site here is highly developed. A lot of industries near the waterway as well. This is the Palm River, which is abuts the southern side of the site. And then if you look over here, this is the McKay Bay. Obviously, this entirety is Tampa Bay, but then there's these kind of sub bays. So McKay Bay, Palm River feeds into McKay Bay, which feeds into Tampa Bay here on the site, which is super highly industrial, especially on the southern side of the site, and more developed commercially and residentially on the northern side of the site. So let's look at some of the flood risk that's occurring on site. If we just look at hurricane storm surge, even from a 1 foot to a 20-foot storm surge, we're going to get a significant amount of inundation on the site. And you can kind of see some of the images from some of the storm surge on the site in the past from the hurricanes. Basically what happens, these giant waves in the bay, in Tampa Bay, feed into McKay Bay, which basically feed into the river, and these surge into the site itself. And these are shown from the slosh models, the different inundation depths from the slosh models, which show hurricane storm surge in different areas in the U.S. So if we look at the current 100-year floodplain, this is the kind of land use makeup with the 100-year floodplain laid atop it. So right now, about 27%, nearly a little over a quarter, I'll say, right, is affected or at risk within the 100-year floodplain. So it will be flooded in a 100-year flood, which, as we know, are becoming more and more frequent as climate change affects us. if we look at NOAA's, so NOAA does, I think, 5 or 6 different scenarios, what they call low, intermediate, high, high, and extreme, right? They have different projections of sea level. So if we just look at the intermediate low, so the low side of things, we project the floodplain up 0.22 meters. We still only see about a 1% increase of the floodplain. So this is a projected 100-year floodplain with sea level rise. So what we see in a lot of research is that people will project sea level rise and they only worry about what's going to be underwater. And so one of the things we do here is we say, look, as the sea level rises, right, the 100-year floodplain is going to expand even more as well. So that's where a lot of the risk, more of the risk, is going to occur. So with an intermediate low, we don't see a huge shift. We have 1% more of the site's going to be at flood risk, increased flood risk, but that's still 2.5 square kilometers. So, but if we look at a high scenario here, right now we see a pretty big jump. 35% of the site will be at risk, as opposed to so a little bit of almost like a 10% difference in a high scenario. So now that's an increase of about 0.54 meters. And then of an extreme scenario, we see extreme sea level rise scenario, according to NOAA, the 100-year floodplain is going to expand to 62% of the site. So the site's currently already pretty vulnerable, a quarter of the site, a little over a quarter. And with sea level rise, we're seeing, according to the different projections, we're seeing even more at risk. And again, it's a highly industrial site, which we'll show you a bit more in a minute. So this is, if we look at the kind of coastal area, this is a section we drew through it. But what you see is that a good amount of these new land uses that are going to be at risk for flooding are industrial. So even with the different intermediate, low, high, and extreme scenarios, we see large increases in the industries that are going to be within the floodplain. So that means that with sea level rise, there's going to be an increased risk of pollutant transfer during flood events. So these chemical mixtures are going to wash around into residences, specifically even in storm surge as the water comes rushing in, right? And so that's it's going to be high risk of contamination mixing across the site as sea level rises. So we look at some of these risk factors, or these industrial and pollutant sources that are on site right now. There's 4 brownfield sites, 2 landfills, 3 Superfund sites, and 4 toxic release inventory facilities that are on site right now. And you can kind of see what some of these are. There's chemical companies, water plumes, construction and transportation and warehousing, manufacturing outlets, those types of things. And some of the major ones are these quarrying, oil and gas extraction plants as well on the site. You can see those major clusters in the map here to the right are on the western side, and on the eastern side they kind of cluster up in these couple of areas. What you see around these green dots here are kind of the drain inlets. So what's happening is most of the stuff's either running straight towards the river, or it's you can see the drainage here. It runs to these drain inlets and is basically just pumped straight into the Palm River here. And so what's happening is that the Palm River is now an impaired waterway. Metals, oils, organics, those types of things are highly elevated in it. And obviously McKay Bay is an impaired bay, because all of this stuff is primarily that stuff that's, as it washes through the community, is eventually put into a sewer and then just directly discharged. It's not treated through green infrastructure or anything like that. So it's impairing the waterway itself. And so what we did, we took the current land use layout. And if you haven't heard of the LTHIA, the Long-Term Hydrological Impact Assessment spreadsheet, it basically takes the land use configurations of a community and it runs an algorithm on the land use configuration once you put it in, and it will give you the runoff, the typical runoff amounts, and will give you 14 different contamination sources that can be found in that runoff and their amounts, but mostly in pounds. So when we run this through the LTHEA model, the current land use configuration, we see COD, suspended solids, fecal strep, fecal coliform, oil and grease, and nitrogen are some of the primary players here. Most of these are found primarily in industrial land uses, but also in commercial land uses. So those are the ones that are contributing most to these kind of higher areas. So you can keep this in mind. We'll revisit this later when we run the scenarios, and then we compare them to this current situation. So one of the ways we did the scenario design was that we predicted for future urban growth and using 3 different scenarios. And the way we did that was what's called the model is called the land transformation model, and it's a GIS add-on program. And basically, what you do is what we call them input patterns and input factors. So you'll put in basically 2 different input patterns. So that's 2 different raster maps, raster data sets that are from 2 different time frames. In this case, we're predicting for urban growth. So we put in the urban area of 2001 and 2011. It analyzes the change between those 2 time periods. And then you build in what we're calling input factors, which are factors contributing to urban growth. And I'll go through a list of those later. I'm just trying to explain the model to you here. And it uses those to help inform where urbanization is going to go as well. And so it runs a neural networking process. And I think we ran 250,000 training cycles. And if you know anything about some of these things, the one that had the highest kappa statistic, we ran a significant amount of calibration models, ROC, AOC, allocation agreement, calibration stuff. So this was a proven model that we used, and so I won't get into much of the calibration. You can check out the paper on this if you're interested in the calibration methods. But basically, it spits out in this particular, it spits out future urban growth prediction. And another thing you can do in the LTM is you can set what's known as exclusionary layers, and that's the way we did the scenarios. So the first scenario is business as usual, but then the second scenario is comprehensive growth based on the comprehensive plan. And what we did was we excluded prediction into areas that the comprehensive plan says don't grow into. Okay, and the same thing for the resilient growth is that we excluded the growth into the floodplain. So that's the way we kind of did it to get those 3 scenarios. So here's the scenarios. So scenario 1 is business as usual. So that's basically growth based on the current patterns of growth within the city. The second scenario is growth as the comprehensive plan says grow. Again, we set the exclusionary layers. Okay, they want to grow here. That's where we're going to target most of the growth, and they don't want to grow here, so we'll exclude predictions from going into there. And then resilient growth is basically the growth as planned, but then we also excluded anything within the 100-year floodplain. And then we looked at it in regards to, what's going to be at risk in regards to currently, but also the future floodplains. And then we did the landscape performance modeling for flood risk, pollutant loads, and even green infrastructure area. We don't get too deep into the green infrastructure amounts, but you can see that at the end here. So these are some of the factors we built in as far as the rasters, the input patterns. In the input factors, we used 2001 and 2010 as our input factors, and basically it analyzes the land use change between those. And this is what the output spit out as far as the different scenarios from the LTM. On the right, in regards to the community, we did it for the whole city. Some of that is in one of the papers at the end if you're interested in the actual modeling and the calibration and the overall risk and stuff. But since this is geodesign, I wanted to show how these things influence the design, and then how we used modeling to also test what the effects of the design. So this was what the LTM spits out as where urban growth is probably the high probability of it occurring. And so we use these outputs for each scenario to inform 3 different master plans, okay? And so basically the idea would be we target the new development in these areas that it says it's going to grow. So I'll show you those plans in a bit. But what you can see already is business as usual. If we look at the future floodplain with sea level rise, about 90% of now this is just the future urban development. So this is not the actual, right, the whole site that's going to be underwater. It's just the amount of the new development, right? So 90% of the new development will be within the future floodplain with sea level rise, okay? Then the growth as planned is lower, but not that much lower, about 7% lower. But since in the resilient growth, right? So this is kind of an extreme way to grow, but kind of an interesting approach is that we don't target any new development in the floodplain. Somehow 5% still, the reason why it has 5% in it is because this is the floodplain with sea level rise, right? So if we target any new development outside of the current 100-year floodplain, there'll still only be 5% of the new development in the future floodplain with sea level rise. You can kind of see those scenarios here on the right as well. So these were the 3 master plans. As I said, we took basically these outputs where it says growth is going to occur, and we targeted these new kind of buildings and land uses and programmatic. I'm not going to get too much into the designs here because I could spend the whole presentation talking about 3 different master plans. But the important thing is I'll go through kind of the basics of these, but they all use the same transportation hierarchy and the same framework. But the building footprints were adjusted according to what the prediction models say, right? So where the growth said it would occur, that's where we adjusted the building footprints. And then the green network is going to be a little bit different in that there's no new development in the floodplain here. In the current 100-year floodplain for the resilient growth, so there's going to be a lot more green infrastructure. But the green infrastructure is placed in areas that, at least the larger scale green infrastructure, that 1, don't have development now, but 2, weren't predicted to be developed in the future. And obviously there can be smaller scale, low impact facilities that are tucked into that development, which we talk about in the plans, in the programming. But the larger spaces, which weren't predicted for development, those became basically green space. So you can kind of see the land use breakdown, which I'll get down. There's a lot more green infrastructure or green space in the resilient growth, which it's a lot, I wouldn't say significant, but it's a little denser as well in that we had to make room for the developments elsewhere, right? So you have to increase the density, that kind of stuff. So if we look at the land use breakdown, it's around 40% open space in the resilient growth, where we don't see a lot more. We don't see a lot of open space in the growth as planned or the business as usual. But basically, what you're going to see in a lot of these outputs is that the comprehensive plan is actually a better way to grow than the way they're growing now in almost every category we analyze it. But the resilient growth is significantly better than both. So you're going to find the plan is good, but it could be a lot better if we take kind of more drastic approaches. So if you remember earlier, from each kind of plan, this is the current land use, but for each plan, we ran the new land use configurations from here. We ran these through the Althea model. So in the business as usual scenario, we see around an 80% increase in the pollutants on site. So as they grow, they're going to have a significant amount of pollutants increasing. The comprehensive plan is actually much better, right? It's around almost 53% less pollutants than the business as usual here. At least according to the Althea output, but you're still increasing pollutants around 40, almost 50%. But with the huge amount of green space, we see a negative. The decrease in pollutants is around 11% in the resilient growth because of the immense amount more of green infrastructure and the less kind of floor to area ratio of development that we're seeing here. So a lot of it less impervious surface, basically. So if you look at the overall impact here. We see, again, around 11% decrease also in stormwater runoff, where we have almost 20% in the scenario 1, but less in the comprehensive plan growth. Again, we see decreases in the pollutants with the resilient growth, and a large amount of green space protected in the resilient growth as well. So thank you, and I'll take on any questions.